to shift things so that we could adequately support people's needs. So within today's lecture, oh, I should mention one other announcement. I have posted the first assignment for the course. This assignment is due the 6th of February, so there's about 3 weeks for it. And it'll focus on material that we may start today if we quickly finish up this material. We certainly expect the bulk of it in the next few lectures. Okay. So I would, if I were you, I'd get started in that material. I have suggested the use of a software package for that material that that for the third problem in particular that may be a little bit easier to use. You could use either the one that I've already had you download, AnyLogic, or you could use this software package called Vensim. There's a thing called Vensim PLE, Personal Learning Edition, which is available for free download. And the last problem in particular may be just a little bit easier to do in that version. But you could do it with AnyLogic. In fact, you could do the second or third problem with AnyLogic. The first problem you don't need a software package for. It's asking you to do something by hand. You could use either of those packages if you wanted to illustrate it, but it's not at all required. Okay. So that's problem set 1. February 6th is the date. Yeah. I also posted a link on Moodle, if I'm not mistaken, to posted a link to the website, which then has the videos linked to from it. Okay, so this lecture and the last lecture, I consider a little bit of hard slogging of this course. Hard slogging because it's abstract material, important conceptually, but quite abstract. You're going to see it illustrated through many of the examples later in the course, but from my experience, it's useful to orient students with respect to sort of the modeling process, so they know where things fit in that we'll be covering. Who can remember some of the things that we covered last time in this class? What were some of the topics that came up? Problem formulation. Great. So trying to identify the problem that we're trying to solve or the research question we're trying to answer. I gave an analogy, models as maps, right? The idea was that no map is perfect, but it doesn't aspire to be. It aspires to inform a certain purpose. And a model is the same way. Now, a model captures for us some representation of how we think the world works, or how we think it may work. And we're really talking about some aspect of that work, and we're sort of abstracting away from certain details. I've heard computer science called, and I'll certainly use this aphorism myself, the science of abstraction. Much of computer science is about how we abstract away from details towards more general principles. How we create abstractions to represent useful constructs, and those abstractions can then be used in many places. So those of you who have been through 214, which is I think everyone here, and certainly those who have been through the software engineering track, will recognize that abstraction, figuring out how we capture commonality within a program, within different areas of the program, is one of the keys for effective software engineering. We try to create abstractions in the form of methods, in the form of classes that are general enough to be reused in a wide variety of places. and then we use these abstractions. And part of the sort of unique character of computer science is that we can pick our abstractions per what's most useful, what's most transparent or clear from a perspective of other people modifying the code or us understanding it. We can pick abstractions of all different sorts. I mentioned two of them, sort of from the lowest level: methods, classes, and at a higher level yet, languages. By languages here, I do mean computer languages. We have the unique potential in computer science to not only be able to choose how we go about solving a problem, but choose how we frame that process, how we characterize that solution. We can build tools that make describing a solution easier. How many people here have taken the course on programming languages? Okay, so you would have seen Haskell, I think. Oh, did you see Prolog as part of that? Okay, so those are two great examples of languages which have characteristics very different from classic imperative or object-oriented programming languages. And something like Prolog is really, really useful for describing certain types of problems. Right? So if you have a constraint matching problem, you might phrase it in Prolog a lot easier than you could phrase it in Java, for example. Now, anything you can do with Prolog, I'd argue you can do with Java, and vice versa. They're what's called computationally universal. Have people encountered that concept before? Computational universality? So any program I write in one language within a class of computational universal languages, I can write in another. I can do anything in either language, but it'll be a lot clearer, or a lot more efficient, or a lot more expressive, a lot shorter in certain languages rather than others. So if I want to write a program which manipulates strings a lot, what language might be a good language to manipulate strings in? Okay, Awk is a great example. Another one? Python, Perl, Ruby has some things for that which are pretty nifty. Good. What would be bad languages to write in? C. Yeah, that would be painful. What's even more painful than C, probably? Okay, well, yeah. Fortran, that wouldn't be that great. That might be an example. If I wanted to do a highly numeric computation, doing it in Fortran might actually not be so bad. Doing it in something like Perl might be kind of ugly. Doing it in Awk would be downright hideous, probably. And doing it in assembly language, well, maybe beyond pain or something like that. So the point is, we can pick our languages to match the problem. And what you're going to see in this class is a really interesting set of examples of that, because we're going to see simulation languages that are tuned for certain areas of problems. And you can see that they'll allow you to really nicely characterize problems of certain sorts, but not others. So much of this class is really about choosing abstraction. And much of building the simulations at a practical level for a particular simulation is about choosing your abstractions. Choosing what things about the world you want to characterize. Now, when we build software for software development, much of our notion of abstraction, the notion of abstraction has much to do with encapsulation, hiding details, and revealing only certain elements. It also has to do with capturing things in a very general way that can be reused, often parameterization. But here, when we're talking about sort of abstracting things in the world, it's also about hiding details. We ignore details when we describe certain processes, not because we think that they have absolutely no bearing on it necessarily, but because we want to understand better what may be driving it. We don't necessarily want to appeal to those. We want to see if we can explain it without appealing to those. We want to see if we can explain it just by recourse to certain factors alone. And then over time, we may add in some components we've left out. But there may be some that are completely implausibly related. Example would be, it's unlikely if you're simulating cars in the traffic patterns within a city that you're going to need to simulate the hair color of the drivers or something like that. It seems totally implausible that that's going to have a measurable impact. And so we'll build models that capture what we believe are salient details. So that was an important part of what we talked about last time. What's some other elements of what we talked about? Anyone remember? Sorry? Yes, that's right. So the common division between three things, in fact. So that's very good. Your name is? John. So division between, on the one hand, endogenous, exogenous, and excluded. So what are endogenous things? You can remember. Endogenous things are things that are
calculated with every step.
Yeah, exactly. The model is generating them with your set. In other words, it's sort of, over time, it's calculating what those are. We don't build that into them. We don't presuppose it. It's actually computing those forms, maybe on the basis of a lot of other things moving around. So an example of traffic simulation might be, where the traffic jams are. We're not telling, assume a traffic jam on the University Bridge at 4:30 in the afternoon. That comes about because of the traffic patterns we calculate, we derive, or that we place in there. So people go between work and home, and a lot of people work in the city and come back, or vice versa, or what have you. People go out shopping and eating, or what have you. So the traffic jam emerges from that. So that would be an example of an endogenous thing. What's an exogenous thing? Okay, yeah, you can kind of think of it like that. So it's something we may figure out from outside the model, but we tell the model about it. So there's some model representation of it. There's some model reification, some sort of representation of it in the model. So it's there. Maybe it would be people's work-home schedules going between work and home. So we say people, for 80% of the population, this sort of schedule, the remainders or these sort of graveyard shift, et cetera. And we just assume this schedule, that these people go between work and these sort of times. So that's represented in the model. We can change that assumption in the model because it's represented. It's actually very explicit. But it's not calculated by the model. That doesn't emerge from the model. And then finally, there's this notion of ignored. So we've consciously thought about it, and we've decided to leave it out. We considered whether to put it in, and we said, okay, no. So an example in that case might be, maybe we decide to leave out one-way streets from a simulation of traffic at Saskatoon. And we decide to leave out simulation of traffic stops by police cars. So we decide to leave out auto accidents. So we abstract away from auto accidents and say we're going to assume we're going to be simulating traffic jams that result from kind of common patterns of flow. We're not going to be trying to deal with what happens in auto accidents and the special types of jams. So that would be, it's not a perfect representation of reality, but it may be good enough for our purposes, because if we're city planners, we want to know what traffic jams are we causing by our designs of roads, and a lot of them will be just bottlenecks because people have to get between places and they can't go over the Victoria Bridge anymore, right? Okay, so these are sort of an important common division. We also talked about mapping techniques. So we talked about there's techniques for, long before you build a simulation model, you map out sort of how it's going to work. So you don't have a fully quantified model, but you have a sort of a schematic of one. Sort of in the same way that we might create a class diagram before actually casting things in code, or we might create pseudocode. We might create object interaction diagrams long before the objects themselves are ever run. So We talked about that sort of model mapping, and we're going to see that a lot more next time, and maybe at the end of today. But I wanted to finish up this description, and I do so because there's some really rich stuff that has to do here with the kind of the philosophy of modeling. And this is important stuff because not only because it relates to sort of why you model, but also because it guides what's desirable in a model. And it also informs what you should be thinking about when you build a model. You folks are in the next generation of models. And types of models that you folks create during your time will be a very significant advance over state of the art, 10 years ago, or even probably now. And there's some things that you should be thinking about to push the envelope. And I want to talk about these things. So I'm trying to situate us within this process. So we talked about problem conceptualization, problem mapping. We're on model formulation. I'm going to go through this next part. I'm going to try to finish it up today, certainly. Model formulation is really about the process of getting a model that's fully quantitative, a model that can be simulated. Of course, it's about simulation. It's about building models that are capable of simulation, dynamic model. And there's a lot of components of it, specification of parameters. We're going to have to specify unambiguous relationships between variables. This depends on this in that way. I hypothesize that that's the relationship. What are the implications is what the simulation will tell us. Decisions or behavior rules, like for agents, under what conditions do they do what? And we'll see that that's actually quite a rich topic even by itself. It turns out interactions between agents, for example, are typically carried about by messaging. How many have seen message passing before in this class? Okay, a couple people. Maybe you saw it in networking course or operating systems. Maybe you saw it in concurrency. So message passing is a very effective technique for asynchronous communication between agents. So it's not like A calls B and they have to have that call executed immediately before A can go on. But it's a way of A notifying B of something but being able to continue on. It decouples them. And we'll see that in model formulation and agent-based model we have things like mobility, agents moving around the landscape. We have issues of sort of agents changing their relationships and networks, etc. Okay, so this is yielding a fully quantified model, and there's a bunch of stuff that we need to fill in to make it fully quantified. Now, what we're going to see is in the types of modeling that we're going to be doing, the ones we'll spend the most time on are stock and flow models, which are part of system dynamics and agent-based models. And the way I kind of characterize these is hedgehog knowledge versus fox knowledge. That's based on a Russian proverb that sort of talks about the knowledge of a fox and knowledge of a hedgehog. And the idea is that a fox knows many, many things a little bit, and a hedgehog knows one thing really, really well. Fox is clever in a whole bunch of different domains, how to get grapes, how to raid the chicken coop, what have you. And a hedgehog, by contrast, knows how to roll up, curl up, and have its spines out. And stock and flow models are really about using just a small amount of vocabulary and very clever sort of combination of ways. So you have a small number of verbs and nouns, as it were, and you combine them in creative ways. And you can do really interesting things with just those elements, and you can get extremely interesting behavior out. Agent-based modeling will involve a much larger modeling vocabulary. We will see state charts. We will see, in fact, stocks and flows, which we can use in it. We'll also see events. We'll see messaging. We'll see a variety of types of ways of encoding sort of actions associated with agents. We'll see mobility issues. We'll see network issues. So there's a broader variety of things, and we'll kind of mix and match for a given model here. In a system dynamics model, basically always using stocks and flows. Every system dynamics model will come to stocks and flows. And I would say that discrete event modeling will be somewhere in between these. So here we have a larger set of models and needs. And these draw on some things very familiar to us as computer scientists that we'll talk about, subtyping, subclassing, for example. And we'll see some of the things that we've seen in UML, such as state charts, being very important. Okay, I'm going to skip forward here. I noted that this distinction between synchronous and asynchronous. And in an agent-based model, we're going to have agents evolving in an asynchronous fashion. They're evolving in parallel, concurrently. And in the context of this sort of concurrency, we will have needs for communication. And by and large, this communication occurs asynchronously, and particularly through messaging. So you'll have sort of these interactions of these agents through messages. And sometimes an agent will send a message to the environment or vice versa. Last time we started to talk about ODD. ODD standing for Overview, Design, and Details. And I want to talk about these design concepts here because they are food for thought. This is particularly used in the agent-based context. And in that context, we have to consider a set of issues. And these, again, have to do with the philosophy of modeling associated particularly with agent-based modeling. But I want to go through these because they get to some of the heart of the motivation for using dynamic models in the first place. I particularly highlight, in terms of these design principles, the issue of emergence. To what degree are results pre-programmed versus arising naturally out of a bunch of interactions? Much of the goal of these models is what Josh Epstein terms to be generative. They're generative models. We try to explain things by reproducing them from the simplest possible sort of hypothesis about what may be going on. We try to describe complicated patterns in the world via very simple parts interacting. Try to describe how all this complexity could come from just very, very simple principles working together. And that's a very powerful form of explanation that, until the power of computers has been available, really wasn't too feasible. You could do some things by hand calculations, but it's very hard to sort of, very tedious to see these patterns emerge. It points to the science of complexity, the fact that we now can perhaps find patterns and things that otherwise seem just incomprehensibly complex. So we'll see in a few weeks, we'll talk some about this notion of chaos. How many people have heard of chaos theory? Okay. Can anyone provide a description of chaos? Sort of one characteristic of a chaotic system. Good, good. So the analogy that's sometimes given is that a butterfly flapping its wings in Buenos Aires could cause a tornado in Texas, something like that. And the point is that very small differences in initial conditions could lead to really big differences later. And you expressed it very well. Remind me of the name? Matthew. So Matthew expressed it very well in that he emphasized that phenomenologically, in terms of the observation, what you may see may look random. It may look so disordered that there's no structure there. It just looks like, chaotic, chaotic, yes, thank you. It looks like stochastic behavior. It looks like this sort of behavior that's inchoate. There's no regularity. There's no pattern. There's no structure. There's no sort of persistent pattern in it. But in fact, hidden in there is great regularity. And we'll see how this sort of behavior can come about quite readily within the context of these models. You combine nonlinearity in with instability, so certain types of nonlinear systems are unstable, and you can get this sort of phenomenon. And you could look at something like the pattern of drips coming from a faucet. This is something they looked at back in the 80s, Doyle Farmer and others, at this so-called collective that they put together. They looked at the inter-arrival time of faucet drops. So you go to the faucet over here in Spinks and you measure the time between points where it drops. And you look at a distribution of those, and you see some, normal distribution around some point, perhaps. You look at it as a plot over time. You don't see any particular patterns. But if you look at it in the right way, what you actually see is a huge pattern. There's a huge underlying structure that dictates the evolution of this thing. Now, any one drop might be hard to predict exactly when it will occur, but the overall pattern is extremely clear about sort of the underlying driver for this thing. So in emergence, we can sometimes spot very chaotic patterns, very inchoate patterns, patterns without obvious structure, and we can explain them. But we can also explain just very complex patterns like traffic jams, perhaps in very simple ways. So we're gonna see this, how certain patterns emerge in a way that in no way do we build in. We have a powerful way of explaining them if we haven't built them in, and yet it comes out from a predictive analytics, as it were. Adaptation. How does the system evolution itself lead to entities to change their behavior? So under what conditions, it's very important when we build these models, when we're thinking about agents, for example, that we not assume that the agents are merely automatons. They go through life with certain fixed patterns that are independent of what's going on around them. That's not typically a pattern we see in people. It's not a pattern we see in cars driving. It's not a pattern we see in company evolution. People change based on circumstances. Companies change based on the competitive climate, based on the interactions with their competitors and with their elements of their supply chain or their alliances. So, we should be asking, okay, how does this evolve? Sensing, what information do entities retrieve from the world? So if we have agents, what information are they getting from around them that allows them to change their behavior or to evolve their behavior? Drivers, what information do they have access to? What information do they not have access to? For example, it's well known, so I lived in Southern California doing modeling for a while, and there were predictably traffic jams at certain places on the highway. So for those who haven't been there are highways 12 lanes wide each way within these highways. So I-405 and I-5 going up towards Los Angeles from Westminster County. You can get 10 lanes easily, 12 lanes in certain places, parallel, all going the same way. And yet there will be traffic jams. Traffic jams at 2 p.m. Doesn't seem like rush hour. Rush hour begins 3:30. But you will see traffic jams reliably at certain places. And the places are not particularly obvious. They're not like interchanges, although there's some traffic jams there too. But some of these places don't seem obvious. But in fact, if you study it, it's because there's a curve in the road, or the road goes up and you can't see just what's ahead of you too far. So people tap their brakes, and collectively that leads to a behavior where you get shocks of traffic, sort of a brakes going back, and traffic will bunch up and then spread out again as you go over that ridge. So sensing, what information do they have? What information do they not have? They don't have information on what's over that, around the bend, what's over the ridge. And so the entities back up here. We're going to need to think about, well, what information are they gathering from around them that allows them to change things? Objectives. Are there goal-seeking behavior? So if we were to talk about some of the actors I've mentioned, can anyone give me an example where we might see goal-seeking behavior? Yeah, okay, so what might they be seeking? Water is a good one. Might also be seeking food. Might be seeking mates, particularly for the male deer who get in rut, they start running amok. So that's good. How about companies? What sort of goal-seeking behavior might they elicit? Yeah, so that's a classic one. In some cases, it may be maximizing customer base if they're kind of in the early stages. So one intriguing thing you can have within these sort of simulation models is agents that they have a goal. They're trying to maximize some goal. They observe things around them, and they try to intelligently do things such that their behavior is emergent based on that goal, right? And that's important because their behavior might change if the incentives are changed. For example, if certain types of tax policy you put into place, or things that affect their profitability. Let's suppose a carbon tax. You might be able to simulate that with that. How would a company's behavior change in the context of a carbon tax? You might look at that as an emergent property of the regulatory environment, rather than just saying companies behave in this way. That's our theory of companies, regardless of the situation. That actually might be something that emerges. Interaction, how do they interact? And what things do we describe as stochastic? What things do we describe as it's just chance within the model? We abstract away from reasoning about the details of it. And what things do we actually try to model? What things do we model the structure underlying? And then, what processes are observing our model for reporting purposes or for calibrating that doing sensitivity analysis, what have you? So let's just talk briefly. So sensing. Information sensed from the environment. For an agent, what's sensed around them? What, their behavior, in what way does it depend on what's around them? Maybe a deer, senses around the water, and they go towards that water if it's within a certain distance. Or maybe they just sense if they're at water and they stoop to drink. May want to capture the fact that perception is typically localized. This is important because behavior may be locally optimal based on what you see around you in terms of goal seeking, but it may not be globally optimal. You may go down the street, or you're driving, you may go the way that looks less crowded based on your observation. But you don't necessarily go the way that we fastest because you don't know perhaps traffic later on. And so you may make locally smart decisions, but that can lead to systemic patterns that lead to, say, traffic jams, right? Everyone, Woody Allen said, what was it, that place is so crowded, no one goes there anymore. You make a decision based on sort of local considerations. You have everyone doing that, and that can lead itself to certain patterns, certain sort of surge behavior in certain ways. So sensing is sometimes delayed. So this may sound strange, but the delays associated with reporting orders, for example, or reporting shipments, etc., have traditionally been a big source of company dynamics. So in other words, the cycles associated with corporate operation are tied in with reporting delays. The fact that with a certain frequency they collect information on what's going on with them and make decisions accordingly. So they up their orders from their suppliers based on customer orders only periodically. Sensing can be error prone. You may make a mistake. You look down these different streets, see which looks least crowded, and you've got error prone information. It may be distorted, it may be you misjudge things or what have you. Now it turns out that there's some really interesting simulations where sort of thought piece models where imperfect sensing leads to qualitative changes in behavior. A strategy, so there's an intriguing game. Have people here heard of the prisoner's dilemma game? Okay, we'll see that later in the semester, but this is a wonderful game that's related to what's called game theory. Okay? And it basically posits or examines this situation where you might have two agents that each behave in ways that seem locally rational, but overall the behavior that results is globally very undesirable. So each of them behaves in ways that seems to make sense for that individual, but they end up in a situation neither would prefer. Neither would prefer the situation they end up in, because they're each making these rules that seem to make sense for them, but they'd actually be better off if they chose differently, and they'd end up in a much better situation. And it has to do with two prisoners caught after escaping, and they're each interrogated. And the question is, are they going to blame the other one for this escape, try to blame the other one, or will they just keep quiet? Now, if they keep quiet, and both of them keep quiet, the punishment will be there, but it's less bad than if they alone are blamed for it. Now, the best situation for them individually is to blame the other one. They may think. If the other one doesn't say anything and they blame them, the slammer is heavy on the other guy and they get off best yet. But the problem is what will typically happen is they'll both say the other did it, and they'll get a fair bit of punishment because it's obvious, there's some lying going on. They're not playing along. So the question is, is there a way, when we have prisoner's dilemma situations, is there a way to kind of break that adverse outcome so that both would be in a situation where perhaps they'll just agree, okay, I'm not going to say anything, no matter what happens, and they'd be better off. But because each is afraid the other will blame each other, they both blame each other, and then the situation is really undesirable. So it turns out that people have done simulations of the effects of the prisoner's dilemma in an iterated way. So on a one-time basis, it's only of limited interest. The interesting thing is, what if you bring together two parties on an ongoing basis, prisoner's dilemma? So it's not just one encounter, but many. What is my best way of responding to someone else's situation? Should I cooperate or should I defect? Maybe at first I cooperate, but if you defect and you blame me, maybe from then on I'll just defect against you. Or maybe I'll do what you did last time, which is called tit for tat. And people have done simulations of that and actually found that the best outcome for that very simple situation is in fact tit for tat. Seems to be a very competitive strategy. However, if there's any misunderstanding, if I misjudge what you did, or I'm mistaken about it in some way, this becomes very unstable. Because then I think, okay, you defect against me, I'm going to defect against you, and if you're doing tit for tat, then it just degenerates into this sort of hitting each other on the back. So anyway, that's something where sensing, imperfect sensing can make a difference. Let's talk about emergence. This gets to this whole issue of philosophy of this sort of model, dynamic model. The fact is, with these models, we're trying to provide generative explanations. Josh Epstein says we don't truly understand a phenomenon until we can create it through emergence. In other words, until we can generate it without programming in it. If there's some phenomenon, we may think we understand it, and the surest sign of that is if we can characterize the underlying drivers we think, and it emerges naturally. So he argues for what he calls generative social science, generative science, that we need to get beyond, sort of statistically characterizing things and so on, and try to actually explain in a generative fashion what goes on. And when we build these models, sort of pursuant to that goal, we're trying to build in as little as possible. I'll give you an example of this, okay? So I work with a modeling team in New York City at Columbia University. A student of mine just went down there, in fact, last week to help counsel them on software development issues. They have a model associated with patterns of obesity and diabetes in the United States. Okay? So it characterizes, it turns out that in the United States, as in Canada, but much worse so in the United States, there's glaring disparities between diabetes rates and heart disease between different ethnic groups. It turns out for African Americans, for group commonly known as blacks, the rates are much higher than for whites. Okay? And there's all sorts of ways people have tried to explain it. You know, that it's the southern diet. There's a lot of eating of, fried chicken or whatever that people have tried to appeal to. And there may be some truth to that, but what their question was, could we explain these rates just by appeal to not something inherent about race, but about the environments that people live in? Could we explain it by the fact that there is segregation that goes on? There's lower quality schools. There's a big difference between Canada and the States that probably you folks aren't aware of. But in States, there's giant disparities in the funding schools receive based on where they're located. And there may be 10 times difference between the amount per pupil available in a rich area versus a poor area. And they basically had two groups within a simulation model. And they were identical groups, they just were different in terms of their color. So biologically sort of the same. They had the same basic habits given a certain situation. But there were patterns of income disparities between them that led to them living in different areas, being exposed to different schools, being exposed to different availability of food, like lack of good grocery stores, lack of availability of parks and recreation facilities, etc. And they tried to see to what degree the patterns of black-white difference could be explained by virtue of these environments once you put them all together. Because it's a very complex system, it turns out. It involves growing up and educational standards and income and issues of food availability and physical activity and all that sort of stuff. And what they found is that a lot of the disparities could indeed be explained by these sort of environmental differences given differences in income levels, etc., rather than by appeal to some biological difference or eating habit difference that was inherent culturally. So if we're thinking about emergence, the degree to which we can explain a phenomenon without building it in is an important principle for modeling. And in fact, agent-based models in particular are often judged for their level of interest rises as you can make emerge more and more basic things from the model. So I've worked with models with physicists that seek to provide gravity as an emergent property of the system, for example, of a simulation. Or seek to describe the behavior of particles within some environment as just behavior of sort of collisions and so on at the particle level, rather than, and the gas laws emerge, these laws relating temperature and pressure and volume emerge from that. So, here we are seeking hypotheses that will explain these patterns in as simple a way as possible. We're seeking to provide a simulation that will elicit these patterns, perhaps reproduce them at a quantitative level, perhaps just at a qualitative level, as we said. Qualitative in the sense of phenomenologically. We see that sort of characteristic pattern of variation over time that we see in the real world. So this was the example I gave with the deer moving around. I didn't expect that. And I believe that pattern is fairly representative of what we do see. Sometimes it occurs, we could see patterns at different levels of explanation, patterns at the individual level, patterns between, these are sort of cities in terms of sort of level of infection there. Okay, let's talk about adaptation. How does agent behavior depend? This really gets to the issue of how does agent behavior depend on their local environment, the characteristics of surrounding agents. And the question here is, to what degree is it fixed based on predefined rules versus is it something which is adjusted based on their environment? To what degree does it depend on their immediate surroundings, and to what degree does it depend on information about the global surroundings? It's notable that you can have interagent emergence without adaptation. You can have agents whose behavior doesn't change over time and get interesting patterns. Doesn't change over time based on their surroundings. But if you do have adaptation, the feedbacks can be much richer. So we saw an infection spread model in our first day. Infection could spread from one individual to another. And there's no change in the agents. They didn't change their behavior based on how many around them were infected. But it would be more interesting if they changed it based on risk perception. So maybe if agents around them were infected, they would cut down their contact. Or they'd be more careful about washing their hands and therefore less likely to be infected if they were in contact with someone. Stay home rather than coming to work if they're feeling sick. These are aspects of adaptation. And this is a very important phenomenon that all too often is sort of downplayed by the models. People and complicated systems do change behavior based on circumstances. If you're modeling a company and you're modeling how it behaves under different market conditions, under different different levels of success in the marketplace with respect to a product, companies undergo retrenchment, they downsize, they seek to enter new marketplaces, they consolidate their products or what have you based on what's observed. So within an agent-based model, and to some degree within a system dynamics model, we have great flexibility representing agent rules, and we would do well to sort of often tailor this based on observation of the surrounding situation. This is something that's not always easy to pick up information on, but it's important for developing hypotheses that generalize, because if we have models where agents are simply characterized in a fixed robotic sort of way, it won't capture the reality of how things adapt over time. I'll give a classic example from HIV. So with HIV, you folks are probably far too young to remember when HIV emerged in the 80s. But early on, HIV infection, human immunodeficiency virus, was a death knell. And in fact, when it first emerged in the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, people weren't sure what was causing it. People were dying. People developed this state, so-called AIDS, where they become so weak in their immune system is just shot, and they catch things surrounding opportunistic infections and die. And there wasn't that understanding of what the virus is that causes this, whether it is a virus or some other pathogen or what have you. And people had all sorts of ideas about this. Now, after it was understood and what the routes of transmission, sexual transmission, infection through needles, for the better part of a decade or so, people became very careful about their behavior. So some of the early cases of infection were in San Francisco bathhouses, where there's a lot of contact between individuals. A lot of them shut down. There was, in the context of this human tragedy, there was quite a lot of fear and quite a lot of changes of behavior that resulted. So people were a lot more careful about safe sex, etc. Now, later, there was a lot of success on the research front in developing ways of treating HIV infection so that it was less of a death sentence. It's still a terrible, terrible infection that wreaks human tragedy worldwide. But particularly the arising of antiretrovirals led to the ability to live with HIV for decades if you had access to the right drugs. And it's a very fast mutating virus, so it was hard to stay abreast of it. But over time, people came to realize that you could live with it. And in fact, this extended many people's lives so they weren't so tragically cut short. But as a result, people's behavior also changed. So some of the risk behavior reduction previously associated with it started to abate. So in other words, people were more risky in their behavior. They perceived it as less of an overall threat. And the numbers of infections in the US started to rise, or the risk of infection started to rise again, because there was more risky behavior practiced. So it is with anti-lock brakes. You know, it used to be that people couldn't count on the car helping them stop, so they would drive at lower speeds. Anti-lock brakes came in, and people realized that they could stop in more of a hurry, and so they tend to drive faster, which kind of mitigated that difference. So, or kind of counteracted that difference. So people's behavior depends on context. It depends on observations. If people hear that a flu pandemic is underway, they tend to change their behavior. They tend to be more careful. So there's 3 ways of building incorporated observed patterns into a model, broadly speaking. One way is to build the patterns directly in. Just, you say, assume this. There's some observed pattern, and you say, assume this pattern. An example would be, I had an interesting discussion one time with a statistician about hospital-seeking patterns for patients in a hospital. And one of the things that you'll see, well, let me see if I can get you folks to guess it. If you had to guess when during the week would there be a particular upsurge in the number of patients that a doctor sees, or that sort of come into a hospital? Okay, a hospital that isn't open continuously. You know, so St. Paul's, their emergency room closes down as the city hospitals. The RUH is open 24 hours, but they're not. When would you expect to see a sort of rise in the number of patients? Monday mornings, actually, yeah. It's Monday morning. And there's believed to be a couple reasons for that. One of them is doctors' offices often aren't open on weekends, and so there's kind of a backlog of people. Another is that people hope they'll recover during the weekend. If they're still feeling lousy come Monday, they'll go in for the doctor. So that's a lot of it. Turns out there's other peak times. Right after the Super Bowl is a peak time. Soon after big holidays, heart attacks associated with heavy eating. Hunting season. Turns out you get a lot. I mean, not to play the stereotypes here, but there's a lot of people who go hunting who are in good shape. You know, during the rest of the year, they're kind of living pretty sedentary lives, driving a lot, not getting outside a lot. And then they get out and they start walking around with their guns, and there's a lot of heart attacks. So my wife's a doc, and she worked on rural rotations, and she'd see at certain times of the year there'd be these quite heavy guys who would come in, shortness of breath, chest pain, incipient heart attack. You know, they're out there. It's that time of year. So these patterns. The question is, to what degree do we want to simulate these patterns? To what degree do we want to build them in? Just assume them. So the case of people going to a doctor's office more Monday morning. Do we just want to say this doctor gets more people Monday morning? Just assume that in terms of the rate of people arriving. Or do we want to say, something like, okay, people start to feel symptoms at a certain rate, and you know there's kind of a backlog of people who would go in who are feeling ill, and they'll go in at the first time that the clinic is open subsequently, in which case that kind of emerges out of it. You get sort of these people coming in because there's been a backlog emerged. And finally, there are cases where, so you can build sort of actions. I'm not hewing quite to this distinction here, but number one is you build a pattern directly into the model. You just say, assume this. Assume people come in Monday morning. Another one is you could assume actions depend in some way on sort of external conditions. Another thing you might try to do is adjust model parameters to see if you can explain these patterns with combinations of model parameters. Certain ranges of parameters might explain the patterns you see, where the model parameters just have to do with assumptions about like the rate people get their underlying illness over time. And you'll adjust that so that the number of people coming in Monday morning and other days best match the data. So here the patterns emerge from sort of underlying mechanics or physics of the model. We're describing the physics, we're not describing the pattern, we're not presupposing the pattern, building in the pattern, and the simulation should try to reproduce that pattern automatically. Okay, the middle one is, so imagine there's agents within the model, and there may be a way in which you could describe the agent's actions so that it varies with the conditions over time in the model, in a way that's that changes the agent behavior based on context, but it does kind of indirectly build in the phenomenon that you see. So here we're not directly building in the pattern, but we're building in drivers that would explain the pattern one step removed from that. Okay, I'll see if I can show an example of this at some point in the class. But the example might be so. I don't know if I want to get too technical into this right now, but if I like, if you analyze my behavior, you might find I spend a certain fraction of my time with my family, a certain fraction of my time with my graduate students, a certain fraction of my time with my undergraduate students in classes, right? Now, that's all well and good. You can describe me as kind of going between these settings with certain rates, and that's fine. But that's not a very general model, because it doesn't deal with many what-ifs. You know, you could say, well, what if I was given another undergrad course? How would that change things? Or you could say, what if I had 3 times as many grad students? Or you could say, you know, what if we had triplets born or something like that? You know, how would my division of time differ? Well, what you could do for that is to describe the sort of preference matrix. So I could say, well, you know, it's kind of like, this is going to get kind of awkward, but you know, on a per undergrad basis, on a per class basis, I'll typically spend this amount of time on it. On a per graduate student basis, I'll spend that amount of time. And on a per child basis, I'll spend this amount of time sort of at home. And you know, my wife too. And then, you know, you could vary the assumption about my number of children. So you could say, you know, what if Oscar had 50 children? You know, how much time would he spend with, you know, in class then? And you can actually look at something like that because if we describe sort of my level of preference for spending time with different things, rather than sort of some presupposition of the amount of time I spend in a certain activity. But it's not as general as sort of a theory of it you might like. So there might be a more sort of physics-based theory which would posit, okay, what amount of work do I have to do with each of these parties? And for example, graduate students, there might be economies of scale. If I have 50 graduate students, I could have a lot of large meetings and get some done, you know, instead of individual meetings with graduate students. If I had, well, this is getting absurd, right? If I had 50 children, we could, you know, we could have a machine that feeds them all at once or something like that. Okay. Don't quote me on that. So in any case, the point is that there might be a way of sort of characterizing the situation at a lower level yet, where some of these patterns were to emerge. Another thing might be, as my graduate student numbers goes up, the graduate students get unhappy with the amount of time I'm able to spend with them, and therefore they leave at higher rates without a degree. Or fewer come because they don't hear that I'm a very good supervisor. And so then it's a self-limiting process. Yeah?
So these 3 discrete labels are just that, discrete labels on a more continuous spectrum of what level we make.
That's
we model.
That's right. And,
okay.
and generally speaking, these are sort of three common ways that you deal with observed patterns. Like, if we have observed patterns, some of them will often try to calibrate the model against. Just explain this as a basis of an emergent property of the model. Others we will build directly in. Others we will seek to explain just at one level, or seek to build in at one level removed. So we can be more general about it and not as rigidly build in this robotic pattern, but it's still kind of dependent at a higher level on what's going on. Is that helpful? Okay. We'll see this in the nature of the course. And again, I apologize, this is a bit abstract now. I'm just trying to situate things, and hopefully we'll come back to the contents of this lecture through the semester. So, ideally with our models, if we have enough time, we'd seek to make patterns emergent. We'd seek to describe lower level mechanics or physics, and things would come out. So an example with that model we saw earlier is this example. There's actually herds in this model. Okay, so there's herd behavior that goes on, and the designers of this model wanted the herd behavior not to be pre-programmed in. So we can observe, and in fact, my colleagues over in Vet Med that I work with, they spend a lot of time going out into the field observing herds. And in fact, they do various amazing things, like they tranquilize the animals, and they'll go take some of its tonsil out and bring it back to the lab for analysis, and then it'll get up when the drugs are abated. But basically, they spend their time observing clusterings of individuals, and it turns out within this model, there's herd behavior that emerges from this, and so they tried to avoid programming in assumptions about how big these herds are. They instead programmed the deer with behavior about how much it likes being with other deer, how much it, to what degree, if it gets thirsty, it goes off on its own versus kind of going with the group or what have you, such that herd behavior plausibly emerged from it. And that herd behavior then is something which would be more robust in the sense that you could ask questions, if you were to have larger or smaller deer herd sizes, or if you were to somehow modify the landscape, how might that change things? Because the problem is statistics. If we're just observing how things are now, we can't observe statistics about how things might be if we've never been in that space. If we're thinking about a totally new policy for a company, or we're thinking about a totally new type of intervention to fight chronic wasting disease, or if we're talking about a new thing on the shop floor for producing cars in Toyota, we can't collect statistics on that because we can't observe it. It would be really expensive sometimes to mock it up. And so instead we want a model to sort of help us understand what would change. An important part of that is more robust models. Models where these things emerge automatically. Okay, so preferably we'll see emergence. So here's some examples of emergence that you might, food for thought. Lower food availability, higher amount of time searching for food. If there's less food around, my watch is frozen. This is unfavorable. It froze at exact time. This is a Swiss watch. And it's supposed to be charged by vigorous movement. Another thing, high prevalence of gonorrhea among acquaintances could lead to greater adherence to safe-sex practices. So if you know your friends at the clap, you might want to be careful. So I don't know if you folks know. This is one of the funnier jokes I've heard since here. By the way, the button's just pulled out. One of the funnier things I've heard since coming here. So, does anyone know Tony Kuselik here? Yeah. Okay. So, I told him an interesting factoid. So I do interdisciplinary work, and I get curious emails quite a lot. One of the emails I got was from a prospective graduate student who was hoping I could support her for a PhD thesis on trimming hoofs in goats. I don't know why she thought I'd be a good supervisor. but I declined to get the opportunity. Would have been interesting, right? Hope trimming. But one of the things I am involved in is, as some of you know, is sexually transmitted infection research. And one of the bugs we work with is gonorrhea. So I work in modeling gonorrhea. And we have some quite detailed models of STIs. And it turns out that that Saskatoon is a capital for Canada. It's the #1 city for some STIs. Sexually transmitted infections here are at national level rates for 1 or 2 STIs. And I mentioned this to Tony Kuselik, and I told him, you know, I think it's going to be some time before the Saskatoon Shine sign gets replaced, you know, by something that says, you know, Canada's chlamydia capital or something like that. And he said, yeah, they'll change it from Saskatoon Shines to Saskatoon Claps. Anyway, cracking up to Tony. So that got me. But so if there's a higher prevalence, people are more careful. This is a phenomenon which is known. People are more careful in circulating if they know there's risk to themselves. If you know people around you have gotten vaccinated for H1N1 flu, you have a higher chance of getting vaccinated. You can describe diabetes and the progression of diabetes over age, not as a fixed thing. Like if you get diabetes at this time, it doesn't necessarily play out in a fixed way over time, or in a sort of just a statistical sort of distribution, but it's based on how good your glycemic control is. So in other words, how good your control your blood sugars are. Better control, less quick progression. This is really important because if you start thinking about interventions for diabetes, it may totally change the statistical patterns and how long it takes people to recover or to avoid getting chronic kidney disease, or to avoid going blind, or to avoid getting problems with their nerves so they can't feel their remote regions, or problems associated with our heart. You know, if you don't build these things in, if you explain these statistical patterns instead of building them in, you have a much more flexible model that can ask more what-if questions. So, you know, the fact that people are more likely to quit smoking when they're older is in part a function because they're surrounded by other smokers who are unfortunately getting lung cancer or coming down with heart disease, or in some cases, you know, dying of emphysema. So there's a higher chance of quitting, partly because of that. That's important because if the amount of cigarettes in the population go down, it may mean less quitting if people are less surrounded by other acquaintances, for example. So there's a variety of things where, you know, we might just build in or impose patterns, and this variety of things, but we'd often do better to sort of explain patterns based on underlying physics because it would be a more general model. It'd be a model that can allow us to explain more and allow us to ask more a broader what-if questions. So one type of adaptation that can lead to emergent behavior is objective-seeking behavior. So here an entity's behavior tries to involve maximizing some satisfactory criteria. Now, there's a lot of problems with this, but for certain conditions, it can be very effective. So companies, for example, do have a very clear goal that they often try to maximize: shareholder value or profit, for example. And if you're simulating companies, you may be able to characterize this. Drivers often have a fairly, something that can be elicited for what their preferences are. Their preferences involve some combination of the amount of time it takes them, the cost, if there's tolls, for example, the familiarity of the road, and this will vary by person, but you can actually elicit these things. And they'll often try to balance their routes based on these sort of criteria. Some people prefer more to go tried and true route. Other people will do a lot to go a shorter route, what have you, pay a lot, etc. Objective-seeking behavior is particularly interesting because if we're thinking about changes that would affect their profit, for example, again, carbon tax being sort of a simple example, another example being tolls on a roadway, we might be able to anticipate how their behavior will change. How would the flow of cars change if we started charging differently for this road in Southern California, or for this pike in the DC region? You know, we might be able to understand better how the car flow would differ if we represented objective-seeking behavior of individuals. More broadly, it might allow us to represent people's behavior as it changes under incentives. So if we provide an incentive for physical activity, you could get a certain deduction off of your taxes or something for physical activity, or for eating more healthily. You could get a discount for food that costs, if the food is healthier, will cost less. How would people's behavior change? These are things that actually you might be able to examine based on a model which captured objective-seeking behavior. What is the problem with this? Does anyone taking economics courses here? Okay, so economics traditionally has hewed very much to sort of a, you try to maximize utility maximization. You try to, and there's all this theory associated with preference functions and associated with, Nash equilibria and situation of Pareto optimality, where situation can't be improved for any one person without hurting another. So you have sort of a matching up. It's good for each party in sort of a way that's okay for both, and it'll be hard to improve. What is the problem with those sort of theories? It's beautiful theory, but what's the issue with it? Did that come up in the economics course at all? Yeah, and the way, the phrasing of it often is bounded rationality, but it's often deeper than that. And research seems to suggest that a lot of human behavior uses sort of rough and ready rules called heuristics. Have you folks seen heuristics in AI? Does it come up? Yeah. So some rough and ready rules might govern, for example, my path home tonight, or the rules I would use in mate selection to decide, sort of how to proceed in searching out an effective mate. People have done really interesting studies which seem to show, from that a perfect rational party would behave very differently than people do. People behave in ways that are surprisingly fragile, in the sense that they don't reason well about a variety of types of changes or problems. Instead, they tend to use quick rules they can deploy with minimum cognitive overhead. No, that's not true for all things. And in fact, there's a different part of the brain that can come in and sort of try to behave very, very carefully when needed. It's just that to minimize cognitive overload, as I walk from my office to here, I can take a couple routes, and I typically take one route. I mean, it's just easy. Whether it's ideal for me, I'm not too stressed about, is this the ideal route in terms of the exact time it takes. But, it's adequate. And so I do that. So objective-seeking behavior is something we have to be a bit cautious about assuming for all parties within a model. But for certain contexts, road traveling behavior can be actually very effective. So Ben and Kiva's work at MIT, for example, has very nicely modeled car patterns in cities around the world. And again, in the corporate context, there's very explicit sort of discussion of these sort of things. There are some other factors involved in corporate decision making as well, though. So another phenomenon is learning. Agents can learn within these models. We can build in learning for agents. And learning may in fact change adaptive behavior. It may be a type of adaptive behavior that involves longer term recollection. It's not just adaptation based on the current situation around you right now. Memoryless sort of behavior based on context, memoryless adaptive behavior. It's actually behavior that takes into account what you've seen before. your experiences previously, the treatment you got from other parties. You know, whether this individual you've dealt with before is trustworthy. Those are really interesting issues. You know, you retain some sense of sort of history with respect to these people. And now, capturing the effects of learning and capturing it well is really hard to do in most frameworks. So system dynamics, it's very, very difficult unless you've got the model focused on one agent. With an agent-based modeling, it can be readily done. And it's a very important effect. I mean, people's experiences, you know, they talk about the Depression generation. The generation that lived through the Great Depression had very different habits for the rest of their lives. Yes?
Do other forms of modeling support learning, or is agent-based modeling the best for learning?
Let's put it this way, individual-based modeling. And in discrete event modeling, for example, which is individual-based, the entities are typically so impoverished in terms of their components that to really get it, you'd want to combine it with agent-based modeling. There's other types of individual-based modeling, like network-based modeling, that sort of abstract away from details of agents. And once again, that would not be too suitable a framework for it, except in as much as it might be described as, in fact, agent-based modeling. So I'd say agent-based modeling is kind of the foremost among those. Yeah. Okay, interaction. So how do agents interact? I mean, if we had a model that was just atomistic individuals sort of bouncing around without interaction with each other, it's not that interesting. A lot of the most interesting phenomena come from the interaction. Come from the fact that there's some interaction. Now, some of these interactions we'll see in simulation modeling are direct and some are indirect. Direct interaction would be an example of one individual influences another, spreads a meme, spreads an idea. Maybe it's about safe sex practices. Maybe it's an idea of what to buy, what's cool. In other cases, it may be spread a pathogen, as we saw the first day. Those are direct interactions. There's indirect interactions too. So in discrete event modeling, what we'll see there is indirect interactions through cues. Okay? So there's maybe two people and they're circulating, and they don't typically interact, except in as much as we have a hybrid model with agent-based. But they don't interact directly, but one may be in a queue that the other then enters. And maybe the waiting time is too long as a result, and they ball. Waiting time too long. Has that ever happened to anyone here in the emergency room? Gone to the emergency room, waited, decided it ain't worth it. Okay, that happened to me one time. Fell while I was curling. Thought maybe my elbow was broken. My wife kind of laughed at me from the doctors. You know, the triage nurse will never let you in. Forget about it. You're going to be sitting there for hours. So we went in, sat there. People around me were coughing, sneezing, coughing. Oh man. Using my computer, working class or whatever. Oh man. After like 4 hours, I decided, man, you know, I don't know if this is broken, but I'm probably going to get more sick sitting here than I will be, you know, getting in. And they triaged me. They know, okay, I wasn't a big risk. And lo and behold, my wife was right. It wasn't a serious thing. Anyway, that's an example of indirect interaction. Well, okay. Okay, they were sneezing. Yeah, okay. But if I modeled that with a discrete event model, there'd be a queue, and if the queue gets too long, I might balk. I might go elsewhere. I might leave the queue and leave the whole system. So that would be an indirect interaction. It's using a resource that I would use otherwise. It takes me longer to get through it because of that. And so I might affect the environment too, and you can imagine a deer putting some prions in the environment, and later another deer getting infected. Didn't interact directly with the first deer perhaps, but it got infected from it. So through the environment is one way. So there's indirect through resources, direct, and sometimes it's metered by space and time. Okay, we're gonna just use the remaining minutes here for the couple remaining processes. One is the issue of an observer process. What you'll see is that your model have a lot going on, but then there's some epiphenomenal components. Has anyone heard this term before, epiphenomenal? May have heard it in philosophy. Okay, So this is a phenomenon that isn't governing other factors in the model. It's an emergent phenomenon from the model that doesn't change anything else. It's purely observational, you could say. It purely is sort of collecting information from the model. So it's a process collecting information, but it doesn't influence the model. It just depends on the model, extracts data from the model, but doesn't change it. Okay. And yeah, there's often a significant amount of mechanism and computational effort realizing this. So maybe periodically your model wakes up and it asks, you know, give me the length of time that, give me the number of traffic jams currently in place that have more than n cars in them, as judged by the rate of speed. It's a traffic jam. Or maybe it wakes up periodically and reports the number of Sony PlayStations sold within the last 2-week period or what have you. Or maybe it wakes up and records the number of people currently infected. So this is an observer process, and this might be used to collect data that's used then for matching with historic data, confidence building that the model is doing something reasonable, verification for testing. So you could test the model maybe interactively, and interpretation of the results, sharing the results with other people, visualizing them, etc. These are important processes. They're part of a model in a large sense, but they're not part of the sort of world process of the world you're trying to simulate. They're instead just collecting information on that. And so there's a significant amount of detail and complexity often associated with these, and then making them accessible via visualization. There's a couple other elements here. Initialization. Where does the initial state come from? Are we trying to actually simulate a particular initial state at a certain time of the system, or are you trying to make it independent of the initial state? You're trying to put it in equilibrium so that it's in a state of balance, so you can disturb it in some sort of way. We'll do both, in fact. Sometimes we want to create a very particular state. Other times, often for models aimed more at insight, we try to put it into balance so we can kind of see its characteristic behavior without worrying about the vagaries of the initial state, without worrying about how that's affecting it. We put it into balance first, and then we poke it in various ways. We change a policy or what have you. Where's the input coming from the model? What time series are fed into it? Like for exogenous factors, assume this pattern of rainfall over time or something. And then sort of submodels. What submodels are there? So you might describe certain parts of the model in an abstract way. There's a partner change module. People change partners according to some algorithm, and we'll abstract over the algorithm, and we could try it with different algorithms, different ways of describing partner change behavior. Or maybe there's a go-to-drink behavior for deer, and the exact route or the exact sort of way they pick where to go, we'll abstract over that. We'll just describe the model as sort of depending on this go-to-drink, and that will be considered as sort of different submodules. So essentially this is about abstraction. We're creating abstractions that are part of the model that are so that it's loosely coupled with the internals of these abstractions. It doesn't depend, the rest of the model doesn't depend on the vagaries of our algorithm to go to get water. It just depends on being able to say, find water, and it will go do the right thing, or evolve my partner network, and it will evolve it, etc. We'll often draw parameter estimates from a variety of places, and we'll talk some about this phenomenon, particularly about calibration. A few things here, just a peek at calibration. Often we don't have reliable information on some parameters. But often we do have data related to the emergent behavior of the model. So what we try to do is sort of triangulate from these data sources. The data source may not be sufficient to give us understanding of any one parameter in isolation, but it kind of constrains our interpretation about what a bunch of parameter values must be to be consistent. And often we'll have several pieces of this sort of emergent data. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to take this data and match the model to all of these pieces simultaneously. So this is data from Saskatchewan type 2 diabetes. and we have a model which sort of very closely matches. Now notice it doesn't match everything. It doesn't match this time series. This is actually a stock and flow model. It's a system dynamics model, and we're not matching the variability. We have other agent-based models that try to match variability as well, stochastics. But here we're trying to match these all at the same time, and we have data on what to match, how to match it, sort of how to judge goodness of fit, and what parameters to vary, and then some tuning algorithm, and we're just parameters over some space to find the best combination of parameter values that best explains, best matches this sort of data. So this is calibration, and sometimes it's done in the context of stochastics, sometimes it's done with a deterministic model. We talked about that last time. The stochastic model, agent-based models, possibly stochastic, stock and flow models, and system dynamics that we'll be featuring next time are deterministic. And there's some conditions associated with statistical reliability we'll talk a little bit about. Model testing, it turns out there's this whole notion of dimensional analysis and reason about the units associated with the model. There's a process called uncertainty analysis or sensitivity analysis, which involves reasoning about our uncertainties. How much do those affect our results? Sometimes a lot, sometimes almost none at all. And to what degree is our model robust under uncertainty about how things will evolve in the future? And then we can look at variations in model output over time of stochastic processes. This from a consulting engagement I was involved in. Sometimes we analyze models mathematically. We'll actually see this a bit in the class. So this is an example of a phase space or a state space where we examine model evolution over time as a function of two state variables, number of susceptibles, number of infectives. And what you'll see here is just one point of evolution. There may be another point, another basin of attraction that we'll go to, which is very different under some different conditions. And it turns out we can turn a model that's a stock and flow model like this directly into a set of differential equations. We can solve it, and we can figure out where the so-called fixed points are, where the system is in a sort of balance. So we'll see that. And then finally, there's elements of policy evaluation, where we can change assumptions about policies. This is a model that came out of our group that we ran for provincial TV control. We still work with them on this, trying to understand how, if they were to change how they try to fight TB, what ways should they change it to make it most effective? And so we had a bunch of policy scenarios that were examined, the amount of TB in the province and how that would change under different conditions for policies they put into place. The final things were the issue of sort of creating an interface. It turns out that within the agent-based model, within any logic package we'll be looking at, you can very readily create very rich interfaces, and it's one of its desirable features. And we'll spend quite a bit of time seeing some of those visualizations. The final thing I want to do today, so I've just covered that. The final thing I want to do today is a point for next lecture. I want to ask you, I want to get a volunteer. Anyone here very good at balancing things and things? Anyone want to volunteer? Okay.
I don't know how good I am.
Okay. Okay, give it a try. See. Okay. Good. Another try. Configure technique. Okay. Good. Okay. That's good. Okay. Not done yet. Okay. So now I'd like you to get ready to do it again. Okay. Put it up. Yeah. Get it ready. Okay. Now close your eyes.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Okay. It becomes much more difficult.
Okay, yeah. Okay, what's the difference between those two situations? Why was it easier to do it first? Why did you keep it going longer at first?
I was able to react to it visually, so if it's starting to tilt, my eyes are able to perceive it faster than my fingers are.
Right. And so you can see it tilting, you can see it moving away from you, and you sort of try to compensate by moving. So generally that's a phenomenon known as feedback. there's a feedback going on here. This system by itself is unstable. If you take this by itself, a slight perturbation, being slightly off being at right angles, will lead to it to fall. With feedback, you can actually compensate for that. You can have a balancing sort of process, a loop which seeks to keep this thing in balance, and it can compensate. And in fact, if people are really good at this, they can keep this going for many minutes. Just keep it continuously in balance. I'm not very good. The point is, the observation allowed you to behave in a way that helped compensate it for its instability. Okay? It helped compensate it for the fact that it's inherently unstable system, and you can actually make it nearly stable, nearly keep it in balance if someone gets really, really good at it. Now, I'll use another example here. How many people here are comfortable driving from campus to home? Yeah? Okay. How many people here, well, of those, I'd say you probably know the way home very, very well. So, second nature, you can imagine in your head. How many people here would be comfortable driving from here to home with their eyes closed? So, once again, feedback. The critical role of feedback. It's less clear it's an unstable system there, but it is. It's a little bit unstable. And what I'm trying to highlight here is feedback plays a key role in changing system dynamics. I'm using that term in a generic sense. The dynamics of the system, behavior of the system. This is sort of a poor man's example of it here. But it can make the difference between a system that's wildly unstable and a system that more or less is maintained effectively. Planes are an example of this. Many types of planes are inherently unstable, but they can be flown very effectively. And in fact, you can take advantage of the instability in certain cases to maneuver, say, in fighter jets very effectively. If you use feedback in the right ways, the addition of a feedback can qualitatively change the behavior of the system. And by choosing to artfully add feedbacks, to judiciously add feedbacks, we can improve system behavior in a way of our choosing. So this next topic we're going to be going into, system dynamics, is about this issue of managing complex systems using feedbacks. It's about identifying the feedbacks and designing in the feedbacks in many cases, anticipating the feedbacks so that we can behave more sensibly. And it focuses on feedback because feedback drives many of the, in fact, some people would argue almost all of the interest and behavior in the system is associated with feedbacks of various sorts. This instability, turns out, is associated with the feedback. The further it falls, the more there's a downward force on it, and it falls faster and faster. That cancellation of that through observation, based on informational feedback for you. So structuring the feedback, changing the feedback structure to make a qualitative difference in behavior, and doing it carefully and in a judicious fashion can allow us to achieve things with complex systems we wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise. So we will see next time an introduction into the feedbacks and how we can diagram the feedbacks in a semi-qualitative way, and then tie it into these stops and flows we were talking about, which are also part of the picture. A key element where there'll be feedbacks involved in the stops and flows, but also inertia, also sort of slow change of the system associated with some memory associated with the stops. Okay? So next time, 2 days from now, we'll be going through system dynamics. We'll be starting on system dynamics and talking about its qualitative and quantitative components. Okay, so that's all for today. I did post the first problem set for the class. So I'd suggest you look at it. It is due on the 6th of February, okay? And it will involve system dynamics. Coming out of next lecture, you should be able to do the first problem. Yes, I announced that before you came in. Okay. So I'm grateful for people's comments in the doodle poll. There look to be